Everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with another deck guide. This time, one we've been kind of working on the channel a little bit, at least one of the variants of the deck, and that is Quintorius Can Combo. Now, Quintorius Can was the Discover combo deck that didn't get banned when Geological Appraiser got banned. Basically, it's based around the namesake card, Quintorius Can, the Planeswalker, allows you to discover 4. Ideally, you would want to flip over a Spark Double, copying it. You get a bunch of eventually you get a bunch of Quintorious Cans in play because Spark Double makes them non-legendary, and you just kind of Tendrils of Agony-esque your opponent out of the game. Clever Impersonator here as some number of backup copies in this particular version. Now it's really come down to 2 variants of the deck. The first one is the Greater Tanuki Beanstalk Giant ramp combination. Ideally, you want to go turn 2, interact with your opponent, turn 3, ramp with either one of these, and then turn 4, cast Quintorious Can. Now, this version I haven't played as much with of late. Whenever I was playing with it, it was before they adopted the Garuda Doom of Depths, so the ideal curve was like turn 2, interact with Bedeck Bedazzle, or Consign to Oblivion, or whatever interaction piece you could find, and then ramp on 3, Quintorious on 4, GG's. Now, obviously, Garuda has kind of added redundancy. Basically, you have 4 Garuda, 4 Trumpeting Carnosaur, and 4 Quintorious. The downside being it's very difficult to ramp into that before turn 5 without having your Elemental Masterpiece. So I don't know how this version plays out in comparison to the one that I'll be talking about in a little bit. But in terms of speed, whether it's fast enough, but basically you're still trying to do the same thing. Find your Quintorious Can off of your Trumpeting Carnosaur or one of your clone effects, and then kind of win the game that way. And your backup plan is kind of beat downs with big dumb idiots like Hornlock Whale, Trumpeting Carnosaur, Greater Tanuki, a whole pile of Garudas, etc. Very similar to the old Garuda combo deck. Now, the restriction with the Discover 4 means you either have to play these double-sided cards like Reduced to Rubble or Consigned to Oblivion, Bedeck Bedazzle. Some versions in the past have also played a 5th color for Leyline Binding. It all depends on what you feel comfortable with, how far you want to stretch your mana base. But they've all kind of centered on a lot of the same cards. The sideboard, Quakebringers, and now, honestly, there's not a lot of Quintorious Can content out there right now, so it's kind of hard to see what all the Quakebringers are usually for. Obviously, they're for the control matchups. That certainly makes sense. The one part I am not sure of is whether it comes in against matchups like Amalia Combo or Angels, where they're also trying to gain a bunch of life, or if this is just strictly kind of an anti-control, anti-combo thing to get to up your clock. Reduce to Rubble. Reduce, obviously, is primarily something like Mirror Shell Crab that you'll see in some other shells. It's a expensive counterspell that sometimes you just need a little bit of interaction. Finally, you have 4 copies of Dragonlord Dromoka. This kind of serves 2 purposes. Number 1, it's a very good threat to ramp into on turn 4 against aggressive decks, as well as being a house against control decks who are relying on a bunch of counter spells, usually to stop you. Then you have Karuga. Some versions run it, some versions don't. A lot of it just depends on how much information you want to give up, because the only other deck in the format that can generally run Karuga is Karuga Fires. That deck is not all that particularly common right now, and a couple copies of Beseju as ways to deal with things like Pithing Needle or such that could probably shut down your combo. Now, the mana bases, it depends. A lot of them run some number of temples. One of the things a lot of these versions run is Cavern of Souls. Now, while Cavern of Souls does not make your Quintorious Can uncounterable, what it can do is make your Trumpeting Carnosaur or your Garuda Doom of Depths uncounterable, and meaning your opponent has to expend resources to deal with these threats when they're on the battlefield, rather than just being able to counter them. and can definitely cause problems for your opponent in that regard, because you certainly can win a game with the beatdowns of Greater Tanukis and Beanstalk Giants, as well as Gyrudos, Trumpeting Carnosaurs, etc. Some other cards that have seen some amount of play that we'll talk about in the other version, but sometimes you would see Herd Migration and copies of, what is it called? Virtue of Persistence as kind of pseudo finishers to go along with your ramp. Basically, you're making, if you're playing the Leyline Burner version, you were playing 5 land base, so your Herd Migration would make 5 3/3s, and your Virtue of Persistence forces your opponent to deal with it, or you're just constantly getting things back from your graveyard. It's more designed for the attrition-based matchups, but has kind of fallen by the wayside in some of the variants. Bless you. The other version, or a variant of it, is the Torrential Gearhulk version of the deck. Now, what this does is it forgoes Beanstalk Giant and Greater Tanuki for cards like Creative Outburst, Elemental Masterpiece, and Magnum Opus. This is a more temporary form of ramp, but in a deck that's trying to resolve 1 or 2 key spells and win the game, it's a little bit more acceptable, especially when, if you're using Torrential Gearhulks to find your Creative Outbursts or your Magnum Opuses, you're getting enough of a net value. You can potentially find your 5th or 6th mana source, either which way you would need to continue casting other Trumpeting Carnosaurs, Torrential Gearhulks, or Quintorious. The one other variant with this is you do not play Clever Impersonator. Instead, you play the card Released to the Wind. Now, this card was most notable when it was part of the Tybalt Cosmic Imposter and Valky combos, where you would release to the wind the Valky. It serves a similar role. It allows you to rebuy your clone effects, because really Spark Double is the only one that's actually good. The other clone effect, Clever Impersonator or Mythos of whatever, only copies your Quintorious, and unless you have a Spark Double already in play, you're not adding to the number of Quintorii you have in play, because it maintains its legendary status even though you're copying it. So while it does add to your Tendrils of Agony style combo, it does so and not really ask to the stacking static effects of the Quintorious. So the nice one about this one is it allows you to reset a Trumpeting Carnosaur that's been copied with a Spark Double. Allows you to reset the Spark Double. Also allows you, so you can have another copy of Quintorious if you've used one of your Spark Doubles to copy a Trumpeting Carnosaur to try to discover into Quintorious Can. And also, in a pinch, it can be an end of turn, deal with an opponent's Thalia, deal with an opponent's Pithing Needle. It kind of gives you a main deck way to deal with some hate cards that can just be very difficult to overcome. The rest of the deck, Bedeck, Bedazzle, and Consign to Oblivion in the sideboard are kind of 2 mana answers or 2 mana things to deal with opponent's early pressure, because one of the things that can definitely get into this deck is faster aggro decks. Virtue of Persistence, kind of borrowed from the old versions that used to have Tanuki and Beanstalk Giant before they adopted Garuda. Virtue of Persistence is a removal spell that also happens to be a threat in the mid to late game, especially when you're in the post-war configurations where you're bringing in Mirrorshell Crabs and Dramokas, etc. The other cards in this sideboard, and once again, you see the presence of Cavernous Souls to help push through against control decks. Dragon Lord Dramoka is just a house in almost all these versions. You're seeing this. Consign to Oblivion is just another interactive spell. Mirrorshell Crab is kind of the creature version of Reduced Rubble, with the plus side if you can bring it back with your Virtue of Persistence. Languish is part of a, I would say, cute sideboard package, but in some matchups, you're like potentially a Malia combo, humans, decks like Goblins, etc., where they might have just a little bit of interaction to disrupt your combo. It doesn't take much to disrupt Quintorious because of it takes 1 damage basically, or some type of kill Planeswalker effect. Basically being able to guarantee that your Quintorious hits on turn 4, you're hitting a Languish, sweeping your opponent's board. Quintorious can win the game as a Planeswalker or the rest of the value of the deck, simply because of making a bunch of 3/2s and overcoming your opponent that way. So that is an interesting plan that I'm still exploring from Hiro Sakai's builds. The other thing, another card that you will see in some variants, especially if you're playing on Arena, is since Dromoka is not present, you might see Thought Distortion in this slot. This is primarily for the heavy counterspell decks like Blue-White X Control, as well as decks like possibly, well, in the mirror match it wouldn't really be particularly good, but Blue-White Control, Lotus Field Combo, etc. But I do find that most versions play Dromoka, so Thought Distortion is kind of a stopgap on the Arena client. The other card you might see a lot is Vanquish the Horde, which I believe is an 8 or 9 mana sweeper that gets cost 1 less for each creature on the battlefield. What this does is it allows you to get around the casting restrictions of the Discover mechanic, potentially keeping alive the ability to keep your combo in rather than boarding into this Languish plan. Which one is superior, I'm not sure, but it is something to be aware of if you're going to play this deck. Strengths and weaknesses of the deck, obviously it's basically a 1-card combo. You resolve a Quintorius Can. As long as you haven't drawn too many of your clone effects, you're basically going to win the game unless your opponent has very specific interaction. Now, that specific interaction can be something as stupid as Spike Field Hazard, Shoulder's Edict, Bitter Triumph, Get Lost. There's quite a few that, as well as obviously Counterspells, Thoughtseize. So there are a number of ways to disrupt this deck. Now, the advantage of the deck, especially with the Torrential Gearhulk build, which I have a little bit more familiarity with recently, is it can kind of play through it a little bit by, say, especially against a deck like Blue-White Control, end of turn, Torrential Gearhulk, force your opponent to deal with it, especially if you have a Cavern of Souls. Potentially you can try to resolve something like Magnum Opus, tap down their lands, and eventually resolve Quintorious. Or you can just, especially in the post-board games, just slam big threat after big threat after big threat after big threat, whether it be, say, starting with a Torrential Gearhulk on turn, untapping, casting a Quintorious, untapping, casting a Quakebringer, just constantly forcing the opponent to answer powerful threats, and ones that on their own can win the game, and then you back that up with some number of clone effects that can, get more value off a copy Torrential Gearhulk, or get more Discover triggers off of a Trumpeting Carnosaur. Eventually you can overwhelm the opponent if they don't have, the perfect hand. Things that can cause problems: traditional anti-combo stuff, whether it be humans with a Thalia draw, or Boros Convoke with a Thalia draw, or one of their turn 3 nut draws. Spirits obviously can be a problematic, although not insurmountable, definitely problematic. So decks like that can certainly be a problem. I have not, unfortunately, had a chance to play a huge number of games against decks like Greasefang or the rebuilt Mono Green. So I can't really speak to those matchups. A lot of it comes down to opponent's situational awareness, the context of your hand, and the speed with which your opponent's putting a clock on you. If the game gets drawn out, especially against a deck like, say, Rakdos Midrange and such, you do have the ability to potentially overwhelm them, a la a deck like Enigmatic Fires. I have beaten the Malia combo on a number of occasions. I don't know that it's a great matchup, but if you have some type of interaction for Malia, you can often delay the game a turn or two long enough to resolve your own Quintorious. And they don't generally have a lot of answers to Quintorious in their deck. They might run some numbers of Get Lost. That was a little bit more common when Appraiser was in the format. Or just have some other sideboard tech for it. But that is a matchup I feel is reasonable. I almost always like playing against the Is It Phoenix decks because, much like a lot of other combo decks, they're just a little too slow and don't have enough relevant disruption. The Grixis version is a little bit tougher because of Bitter Triumph, but I've kind of liked that matchup. Rakdos, I think mid-range is a slightly better matchup than the Sacrifice, because Sacrifice has random things like Mayhem Devil pings that can cause you to blow up the combo. Have not played against Lotus Field because, like I said, most of my play with the deck is on Arena. Although they're relatively even speed decks, so I'm not sure which one I would favor there. And then finally, Control. I used to think Control was absolutely abysmal, but after this past weekend where I had to face it a couple times in best of one, and I think I played it one time off screen in best of three, it doesn't feel as bad as it used to, specifically with this configuration. And I'm sure the Garuda deck is kind of similar. You just have more things they have to answer, and eventually you can overwhelm Control because they only have so many answers that can answer specific things. And just playing Haymaker after Haymaker after Haymaker is sometimes very difficult for those decks to overcome. Not impossible. I'm sure Blue-White is actually favored slightly in the matchup, but it is a matchup that is winnable. So that is Quintorius Can combo in Pioneer as it currently stands. Probably my current favorite deck in the format to play. As always, if you like Pioneer/Explore content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.